Morning. I'm going to do a reading of a story that I wrote for my literacy group, and they really loved it and they asked me to record it. So this is The Frozen Wizard by Weston Sandberg. Oh, and this is also practicing the strategy check for understanding. So after every paragraph or so, I'll stop and prompt with a few questions. Okay. Scott awoke in a dark, cold place. He didn't remember where he was or how he had come there. Then it came to him, his wish. Be careful what you wish for, he said to himself. He was only a fourth-grade student at Wimberley Elementary School. He was not used to adventure. But here he was, in the ice fortress he had drawn last week. Stop. Check for understanding. Who is the main character? Where is he? And how did he get there? He tried to recall exactly what had happened, but it was too cold to think clearly. He recognized the room because he had drawn it himself. He had drawn the ice fortress yesterday at recess, but how had he ended up inside of a drawing? Stop. Check for understanding. Why couldn't Scott think clearly? How did Scott know where he was? And what is Scott's problem? Just then, he heard an old voice call his name. Scott, the voice called. The boy looked around the room, but he only saw walls of ice, and at the very back, a doorway. The voice called again. Come to the door. I have been waiting. He was afraid, but he couldn't seem to stop himself from walking towards the door. Stop. Check for understanding. Who do you think is calling Scott's name? Why was Scott afraid? And where will the door lead? As Scott walked up to the door, he noticed a blue light coming from inside the doorway. He took a deep breath and stepped through the door into the light. The door led to another room filled with a deep blue light. In the center of the room stood a dark, blue, cloaked man in a pointed hat. Stop. Check for understanding. Why did Scott take a deep breath before he walked through the door? And where is the blue light coming from? Scott recognized the man dressed in blue. He had also drawn the wizard. He had a sudden thought. What if I'm inside my own drawings? As Scott stood there lost in thought, the wizard began to speak. Welcome, Scott the Great, he who has created our world. Scott looked up at the wizard with his eyes wide open. Stop. Check for understanding. How did Scott know this man? Where is Scott? And why are Scott's eyes so wide? The wizard spoke to Scott with a cheerful voice. Thank you for drawing me, great Scott. I am the frozen wizard, and this is my ice fortress. Scott replied, You're welcome, but to be honest, I'd like to go home now. I don't belong here. I'm sorry, said the wizard, but I cannot allow you to leave. You had better get used to it here. Stop. Check for understanding. Is the wizard a good guy or a bad guy? Why do you think the wizard wants Scott to stay? Scott felt fear creep over him. He reached out to the wizard and tried to grab him by the cloak, but at that moment the wizard disappeared and appeared again behind him. The wizard laughed. Ha ha ha! My powers are too great, and I am too fast for you to catch me. As the wizard spoke, his hands patted a glowing crystal necklace that Scott hadn't noticed before. Stop. Check for understanding. Why is Scott afraid? Why can't Scott touch the wizard? And where was the blue light coming from? Scott felt an urge to grab the necklace, but the wizard disappeared again. Only this time, Scott spun around to catch the wizard as he appeared behind him. Scott reached out with his hand and tore the necklace from the wizard's neck. Stop. Check for understanding. Why did Scott want the necklace? How did Scott know to spin around to catch the wizard? The wizard screamed in agony. No! My magical necklace! Scott felt his hands begin to tingle, and the walls of the fortress became blurry. Without thinking, Scott shouted out, I wish I was home in my bed! Suddenly, everything went black. Stop. Check for understanding. Why did the wizard scream? Why did Scott's hand tingle? What will happen next? Scott awoke from the blackness, but this time he was in his warm bed. He rolled over and checked under his bed for signs of the wizard. Nothing. He was alone. He let out a sigh of relief. Whew. Was it all a dream? He wondered. Stop. Check for understanding. How did Scott get to his bed? What was he looking for under his bed? And where was the wizard? Scott looked above his desk, where he had hung his recent drawings of wizards and castles. He jumped up and ripped them all off the wall and then sat down at his chair at the desk. "Whew!" he said. "It's all over." But just then he noticed something glowing blue under his pillow. Stop. Check for understanding. Why did Scott rip up his drawings? What was all over? What is glowing under Scott's pillow? In a careless dive, Scott dove headfirst onto his pillow. He reached his hands underneath and pulled out a cold blue necklace. He looked deep into the diamond at the center of the necklace, and just for a moment he thought he saw the image of a man screaming. But when he blinked, the man and the necklace had vanished. The end. Stop. Check for understanding. How did the necklace get under his pillow? Who was the man he saw in the necklace? And what happened to the necklace? Thanks.